Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. Today's episode, we're talking automation, leveraging Power Automate to generate a PSA ticket whenever a subscription is coming up for renewal in Microsoft New Commerce Experience. Now we're going to be doing this leveraging the Pax8 API and the custom connectors within Power Automate for the PSA tool that I'll be using, which is going to be Syncro in this video. Well, we have a lot of considerations. Obviously, we want to reduce liability with New Commerce as much as possible, and we also have this new operational overhead because in most cases we have a different renewal date on a per customer basis in our environment now with New Commerce. Because of the strict cancellation policies and decrement policies within New Commerce, it's very important that you keep up with these renewal dates, evaluate those contracts, evaluate those quantities so you understand how to adjust before that renewal comes due and you cannot decrement or cancel that subscription anymore. So ultimately, again, we're just trying to reduce our liability. So as always, if you guys find this content valuable, go ahead and like and subscribe. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so a couple of things before we get into the Power Automate flow as far as prerequisites go. You do need access into the Pax8 API, which I showcased in my previous video here, but this will allow you to get access into the subscription renewal dates, as well as adjusting seat quantities as part of an automation flow if you want to expand what we're doing here further. Additionally, I'll be using Syncro as my custom connector in Power Automate, but you can set up custom connectors for other tools like ConnectWise, Kaseya BMS, or Autotask if you want to leverage those. Finally, just a note here on the creative side of this, I'm pushing everything and I want to push everything into the support ticket so I can track time associated with the adjustments or communications here, along with documenting those communications within the ticket. But there's a lot of other creative things you can do here. On a very basic level, you can create sales orders within PSA, so your sales reps are triaging those conversations with your customers about those contracts, and this may be more important when we talk about the annual contract terms, not only the quantities of those contracts, but maybe you want to reevaluate the license type as well too. Additionally, you could push messages right into Teams as well if you want more of a lightweight push of this information. And then finally, you could generate approval notices to the customer directly about those contracts, and they could approve that and complete a loop for you, being more touchless as possible in that particular case. If you want to go even more advanced with that, you can also tap into the Microsoft Graph API to pull in other metadata that will be helpful in the ticket, like available versus consumed licensing, to help you understand if you need to true up that contract with the license count itself. Or you could also bring in licensed user information if that is helpful to the customer as well too. So lots of possibilities here, and I'm going to go through the basics today just for the sake of time, but just keep those things in mind while we're walking through this tutorial. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and pivot into Power Automate. Okay, so this is the final output of what we're going to be creating today. We're setting up a reoccurrence for this to run. We're getting a certain date that we're going to validate off of the renewal dates on a subscription. We're gathering some secrets from Azure Key Vault to then generate an access token for the Pax8 API. We're defining some variables that we're going to use through our loop here. And our loop is essentially getting all of the Pax8 subscriptions and looking for a match for that end date or renewal date to equal the date that we're setting above. And if it does, we're going ahead and getting some more variables like the company name that we can use for Syncro search, and also use the product name as well here too to populate in the body of the ticket. And then from there, we're trying to determine if we can find that company within Syncro, and if we can, we're going ahead and creating the ticket here with all the metadata that's coming from the subscription within Pax8. In Syncro here, we have our ticket that's created after that runs and finds a match. And we have our body down below here, which includes the metadata as part of that particular subscription. And now again, this is just some example information. You can get more complex with this if you want, but I just wanted to show this for the purposes of this demonstration. Getting started here, you want to create an instant Cloudflow within Power Automate. I'm also within a sandbox environment here within the Power Automate ecosystem. You can do this in the default environment if you wanted to, but typically I like to do testing in a sandbox and then push it into production afterwards. Here we're going to go ahead and create a name for the flow, and we're going to go ahead and choose the manually trigger a flow. I like to do that for testing just to start off with. Eventually we'll turn this into the schedule where it's a reoccurrence. The next step that we're going to do here is go ahead and do a operation called compose It's a data operation we can set here that can define a particular value for us. In the inputs, we're going to use an expression, and this is something that I'm pasting in here, but I'll walk through it with you. This is in a native expression that we can use here for formatting a date and time. And in this particular case, we can say add days to the current date. So basically, you would want to use this if you wanted to format a particular date, which we do in this particular case. And also, if you wanted to create the notice for the NCE rule, you could either do it UTC now without using the add days method here and just use UTC now, which is getting the current date if you wanted to know on the date of renewal. Or you can create a buffer here. Say you want to know when it's 3 days in advance, meaning the NCE renewal will be 3 days from today. This is giving you a little bit more cushion to then go ahead and provide communications to the customer, so you can really determine the variability here of what you want to do. In most cases, I'd like to use a little bit of a cushion just to give my team time to evaluate that subscription. We'll go ahead and rename this here just to get date. The next step, I'm using Azure Key Vault to go ahead and get my client ID and secret for my Pax8 API. So we're using the get secret operation. I'm just going to rename this to get client ID. And again, if you've watched my Pax8 video that I used previously, you'll know how to set this up for the Azure Key Vault. But I have my secrets in there for the client ID and the secret itself, just so I don't use those in plain text. Doing the same here with the secret. And then I'm going to go ahead and look at creating an HTTP request to get an access token from Pax8. Here we have our URI, the URL for getting a token. We're getting that directly from the Pax8 documentation. We're setting our header here, and we're defining our body, which is our client ID and secret. We're dynamically populating these from our secret values that are above here for both the client ID and secret, and then generating the other parts of the body, which is the audience and grant type. Go ahead and rename this as well too. Next up here, we're using the Parse Json operation here to parse the output of our access token. We're generating this from the body here. And then recall, we're getting our schema from the documentation here that's from Pax8. You'll do the same with Synchro once we get there. We're just going to copy an example response. We're going to click on generate from sample. We're going to paste this in here. We'll click on done, and that'll generate what we need for our schema. And I'll just rename this as well too. So the next thing we want to do here is go ahead and get the total pages so we can loop through the subscriptions, because Pax8 has some native pagination going on with the subscription call. So we're going to use another HTTP request here, and we're going to go ahead and make the request a get, and then we're going to use the subscriptions call. And we're going to say where the status is equal to active, because we don't want to return any canceled subscriptions here. We want to get the least possible. In our headers here, we can use authorization, and we can use our bearer token, which is our access token here. We dynamically generated up here. We can use our content type application JSON. I'm just going to rename this to get total pages. Next here, we're going to go ahead and do the parse JSON again. From here, we're going to go ahead and populate our body. Again, just like before, use the Pax8 documentation to go ahead and grab the schema. And just a pro tip here, whenever I use the parse JSON, I like to go ahead and test that just to validate the schema. Because in some cases, your data model within your own environment might be a little bit different and could cause some failures. So I will go ahead and save here, and then I'll go ahead and run this test. Now you can see my flow failed in this validation, and yours will likely too if you did the exact same thing of copying from the Pax8 API documentation. And you can see here we have invalid type expected integer by got number for the price column here in the particular section, and that's just repeating here for the other values that it's seeing when it's getting that across the various objects that's being returned. So within here, you can come up and you can go to the price object, and we can just go ahead and put in a bracket around this, do comma, and then number, and then closing bracket. And that should clear up that particular error, so we can save again and retest. So now this time we got our success message. That means we're good to go here on our schema. So we'll go ahead and step into the next step, which is creating our variables that we're going to use within our loop. And so the first variable here, we're going to use initialize variable. We're going to call this total pages. This is going to be an integer value, and the value is going to be dynamically set from our above JSON parse here, and this is total pages. Next here, we're going to create a couple more variables. So we'll go initialize variable. We're going to set this one as the current page, and this value we're going to set to 0 initially here. Next, we're going to go ahead and use a decrement variable for our total pages just because of the way the Pax8 pagination works. This is something I had to learn on my own just by testing, but basically the last page returns empty, so we can really just skip over that and not have another operation run. Final two here, we're going to define are a customer name and a product name that we'll set dynamically later on within the particular flow. Both of these guys are going to be strings, and the values initially are going to be set to nothing. Okay, next here we're going to go ahead and step into our loop, which is basically going to use a control here where you're going to use the do until. Now, whenever you're setting this up, we're going to want the current value to be the current page, because we're going to loop through all of our pages from our subscriptions, and we're going to say is greater than, in this particular case, it's going to be greater than our total pages in the subscription loop that we'll be creating. Now for testing, I like to go ahead and just set this to 0 so that we can test just the first page and make sure everything's working correctly before looping through and taking more time, especially if you have a lot more subscriptions. This helps you test faster and just find any bugs within the flow with not having to wait until the entire flow is complete, looping through all of the subscriptions in your environment. So again, we're going to call the same call we made up above here, which is the get subscription call. So we're going to duplicate this by copying it to the clipboard, and then we're going to go into the clipboard and we're going to duplicate that here. We're going to rename this to just get subscriptions, and we'll rename this up top here to loop through subscriptions. And then next here, we're going to use our Parse Json operation one more time. The difference here is that we cannot just copy what's in the Pax8 documentation here because it does not contain the commitment term section that we need as part of our schema. So I'm going to reference that here. I use Postman to go ahead and grab this from an API call. You could use another tool like Insomnia, but I'll post it in the blog post here to supplement what you need. But this is an example of the payload, or the schema, I should say, that you'll paste directly in here. And this actually does include what we need, which is our commitment object here, which includes our end date, which is our renewal date for the subscriptions. So we'll just say parse sub data for this one. And now here, from this particular data point, we need to basically loop through the subscriptions that are part of this page that's being part of the output. So within here, we're going to use a control, and we're going to use a apply to each, and then we're just going to rename this to loop subs. For the dynamic portion of this, we're going to use the content that's coming from our sub data above, and then we're going to go ahead and add an action here, which is going to be a condition. And so we're basically determining an if statement here. So we're saying if the renewal date, which in this case is called end date, and you see there's two values here. You're going to want to select the first value that's returned. I just learned this from honestly just doing the test of this within the environment. There is two variables that are called end date within the JSON that you get back. And then you want to determine if it's equal to your date that you set above, which is your output. So you can't search for get date, you'll want to search for outputs, and that'll be our get date function that we declared earlier for this. So we're saying if this renewal is equal to the date that we set, then we want to go ahead and take action. Now at this point in time, you may want to test this by looking and running the flow, and you can see the subscription data that comes back with all the renewal dates. You could then variably set your get date to that based off of the cushion that we're defining. So again, in this particular case, I set this to 26 to test because there's a date in there that's 26 days out from today. And this will make sure that I'm able to trigger the output here. The only final action you would need to do to test is go ahead and set the variable here for incrementing. And we're going to do that on the current page, meaning that we've looped through this particular page. We're increasing the variable of current page to 1. And since it's greater than 0, it's going to stop our loop. So that way we don't have to wait through all the pages to go through, if that makes sense. So that's just a good way to go ahead and start testing, so you can do this in bite-sized chunks versus trying to create everything all at once and then test afterwards. So if it is no, if it doesn't equal anything, then I don't want the script to continue. I just wanted to keep moving on to the next particular subscription. But if it does find the match there, that's where I want to go ahead and grab a couple of different variables. Now, within the subscription output, you get a product ID and company ID. So we need to look those up to find friendlier names we can use to put into, in this case, Syncro. So what I'm going to do here is use another HTTP request. I'm going to go ahead and grab a company method. So again, you can reference this from the Pax8 API documentation. Go ahead and paste in the URI, and we're going to use the output here as far as the company ID that we're getting from our sub data here as a dynamic value that we can use to search. And then recall, we're getting our access token for our authorization that's coming from above as well too. And that's just a different view here, but you can see that put it in just the same as we did with our other calls. So we'll rename this here to get company by ID. We're going to use our Parse Json method here. You can use the Pax8 documentation again here to generate the schema as well for this particular record. In this case, I like to run a parallel action just to speed things up a little bit as well too. We're going to use another HTTP request here. And this one is going to be to get the product. We'll dynamically populate the product ID just like what we did with the company record. Populate our header information. We'll generate our schema here for the parse as well too from the Pax8 documentation. And then finally here we're going to set our variable that we defined earlier here, which is the product name, and the value here is directly from above our product body, and that is going to be the name. Back onto this branch here, we're going to go ahead and add an action, and we're going to do the same thing we just did, which is setting the variable. This time it's going to be our customer name, and then the value is going to come from our parse company record, and this is going to be the name. Next here, we're going to use our custom connector. In this case, I'm using Syncro again. Take note, I have a video on this you can check out to see how I set up this connector and all of the actions that you see here. These are all from their API documentation as well too. We can use the search query here to basically search for a record. In this case, what we want to do is search for the customer name. And this will look and return our customer value, so then we can get an ID to create a ticket within Syncro. So I'm going to go ahead and parse this search as well too. This is another use case of which I had to use Postman to get a correct schema here. You may have some validation errors. Well, again, I'll post mine that I had as well too in here, which basically will validate here for you. And essentially, you may have different data in your environment that you may have to correct for, but again, just run the test again up here and see the validation errors and then correct the various objects accordingly based off the error messages. So the next thing I want to do here is add another condition or an if statement here, which is basically determining if this returned any value, because obviously I don't want this to fail if it didn't get a company record. So you can use another native expression here called empty, and within there I'm going to populate some dynamic content, which is going to be the results here of the particular search. So if this returned nothing, meaning that if I say, okay, we have this is equal to true, meaning that this came back empty, what do I want to do then? Now you could choose just to have this fail for some particular purpose, but I'd like to have a follow-up. So this is a good example to show you how to use Teams as a connector. And within here, I can say I want to post a message in the chat or channel. I want to post it in a particular chat with a Flowbot in my use case, but again, you probably want to do this in the channel, just have more widespread visibility on what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and search for my name here just to show you as an example. And then in the message, I'm going to say customer, and then populate my dynamic variables. Was not found in Syncro, but has an upcoming NCE renewal. And then I'll just populate the product name as part of that as well too. So this will happen and just give me some failover if I have a company record that cannot be found within Syncro. If this is a particular case where I have the company record matched, then I want to go ahead and create the ticket. So what I want to do here is, again, show you another example of some of the things you can use here to help validation, but also in testing. Scope allows you to test certain things within a particular scope, and you can add another scope to that to basically have a try-catch block, if you're familiar with that within basic scripting within PowerShell, or if you're native to APIs at a certain level. So I want to call this try just because that's what we're doing here. We're going to go ahead and define the compose action, and it's the data operation we used before. And for this, we're trying to get the customer ID that came out of the search function here. Now you'll notice in the screenshot that I'm going to share right here, you have the consideration of nesting within this array, meaning that we have our customer ID, but it's nested between the results, the table, and then the ID. So what we have to do here is use a particular expression to go ahead and pull that out. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is pull this up, and I'm going to click on expression. I'm just going to paste this in, but I'll walk you through it here. This is getting the output of our parse search, so right up here. And then we're going to get the body of that record. We're again going to traverse down into the results section, and then we're going to traverse down into the first record here, then the table record, and then the ID, which is our customer ID in this particular use case. So I know that's a little bit confusing, but just know that we're just traversing an array here to try to get the customer ID that we'll need to create the ticket. So go ahead and say define, and then here we're going to go ahead and create the ticket. So go custom, and then we'll select Synchro, and then we'll click on create ticket. Now again, these fields that are showing are from the creation of the custom connector, so just take note of that. We're going to define our customer ID here. We're going to define our subject, new NCE renewal. Start at, you can use an expression here that's native, which is just UTC now, so it just creates the ticket for this particular time period. Problem type is going to be unique to your environment, so on here I can just call one that I have in my environment. Status is typically just going to be new. You can define priority here. Again, you have more customizability that I'm showing. You always want to create a ticket with a subject. We'll just call this sub details, and then within the body here is where we can start defining all of our dynamic content. So I'm going to go ahead and say the product name, and then choose the product name. And you just keep going like this for everything that you want to define. And you're getting some of these values here dynamically within the sub data as well too. Take note that the commitment term is labeled term as well here too, just so you know. It's not necessarily translating very well as far as the naming convention goes. You might also run up into a variable here that does not return. So we want quantity, and we're showing Parse Json to get the quantity here, which is not what we want, because we want that to come from our particular content here from the parse sub data. This would grab it from up here, which would be incorrect. So what you can do in these particular use cases where it didn't return, is just basically showing that your schema might be a little bit off, but to correct it here, you can go ahead and use this native function or expression called item. And the syntax looks like this, where you can define the actual part of this particular item that we're looping through. And in this particular case, we want the quantity. So that's what we populate here. We can then click OK, and that'll populate here in this particular field. Take note again that the renewal date is the end date value. Again, just a different naming convention there. And then additionally, you could populate something dynamic like the subscription link to get directly into the Pax8 portal. So in this case, you could publish the particular route here and then dynamically populate the ID, which is from our parse sub data. And this will allow you to have that link there so you can go directly to the particular subscription. The final thing I want to do here is finish up my try catch block. So again, search for scope. And in here, I'll basically say that I want to rename this, and I'll say catch. And basically you have to go in here and configure run after, and I want to check off has failed, has skipped, has timed out. And this is basically choosing to decide whether or not to run if this particular item fails. So I like to add that here because within your ticket context, you could have something like validation errors and things like that, which causes this to loop pretty heavily and delay your flow quite a bit. So you always want to add something like this dynamically whenever you're creating these type of API requests. And this would allow you to then either have a fallback as well too, where you can see the error messages in the flow itself if it fails, or you could do things like what we did over here, which is post in a message, or maybe it's going ahead and creating a generic ticket that's outside of this where this one failed. So you can do a lot of things here. Again, this is just an example, but essentially I'd always want to have that in there to have some type of failover if the API call failed in general. So with that, we can go ahead and save and test this out. In Syncro here, we have our ticket created from that, and it generated everything that we put into our body. So all of our variables here are coming through, and then we also have a link directly to get into Pax8 to modify the subscription if we need to. Wrapping up here, back into the flow, we have it run successfully from our test. So the only things you'd want to change before converting it into production is obviously changing this to be on a reoccurrence. So you can look for schedule here, and you can click on that. You can set the trigger as far as the recurrence. You can set the interval and how frequently you want that to run. So in this case, we might want to do it every day, at the beginning of the day, just to show what examples of subscriptions we can get in and then take action on those. The thing that you want to adjust here is back through our loops again. We did the greater than 0 to test, but we want to convert that back into the total pages variable, just so it loops through all the subscriptions within our environment. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to showcase in today's video. Hope this was insightful. Hope you guys can start using this to generate auto renewals for NCE products and subscriptions within your customer environments. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, as I mentioned earlier, like and subscribe if you guys want to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Thanks guys, have a great day.